On the steep summit of Mount Hermon in Israel, 2 miles above sea level, an earth-shaking discovery was made about the fallen angels, one that the United Nations is hiding. Now it's on that summit that Enoch told us the watchers or fallen angels descended to earth. And at the base of that same mountain is where Jesus took his disciples near the end of his ministry to a spot the ancients called the gates of hell. And it was there he told them, on this rock. Was he talking about the mountain? I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Matthew 16:18. And it's on the summit of that mountain where the most famous biblical archaeologists, possibly of all time, discovered an inscription supposedly written by the watchers or fallen angels. And that is not all that he found. This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and today we're going to look at that exciting find and what Jesus and his disciples knew about this area of the world that most Christians know nothing about today. Sure, we know about Peter's famous confession. We know it took place in a town called Caesarea Philippi. But most Christians don't know that that city was at the base of this Mount Hermon, or that the very gates of hell or Hades were there, a gaping cave at the base of the mountain. Now, the evil associations with this area didn't end with the descent of the watchers before the flood. In the days of Moses, in the Old Testament, the region was known as the Bashan. According to the Old Testament, Bashan was controlled by 2 giants, 2 kings, Sihon and Og, associated with the giant clans, the Rephaim and the Anakim, descendants of the fallen angels. During Israel's divided kingdom period, King Jeroboam built a pagan religious center at Dan, just south of Mount Hermon, where the Israelites worshiped Baal instead of Yehovah. In the 1st century, a religious center to Zeus was there. Mount Hermon's name comes from the Semitic root word, Herm, which means taboo. In Judges 3, it was called Baal Hermon, or Baal's taboo mountain. To Israelites like the apostles, this was one of the most evil places on earth. And you know what? The tradition continues. There is a United Nations outpost on the top of that mountain today. More on that and its purpose in just a bit. But also at the top of Mount Hermon lay the ruins of an ancient pagan temple complex. And in that complex was a limestone stele, or a standing stone, inscribed with an oath that the watchers supposedly made with each other to corrupt the genetics of man and teach them forbidden knowledge. The spiritual history of this region is what attracted that archaeologist, Charles Warren. You may know that name. He was one of Israel's greatest archaeologists, and the one who found Warren's shaft on the Temple Mount. Now, between 1867 and 1870, Warren carried out a number of explorations in Israel. Sir Charles climbed up the steep sides of Mount Hermon, where he found the southern peak's rocky terrain appeared to have been scooped out to accommodate sacrificial altars to the ancient gods of the mountain. Fascinated, Warren explored and surveyed the area, documenting much of what he found. He then discovered, within the area, this strange standing stone, or stone pillar, also known as a stele, and it was engraved on one side in an ancient language, the closest language being ancient Greek. Before leaving the summit, Warren chose to remove that marker, and we are so glad that he did, and we'll explain why in a second. And he carried it down the 9,000-foot height, and he wanted to transfer it to London. But because it was 4 feet thick and heavier than his team could manage, he ordered the stone be broken in half. And although the lighter weight of a stone allowed it to make the trip down the mountain, the ancient stone was damaged as a result of cracking it horizontally. So Sir Charles was British, so he took it to the British Museum and had it inspected by scholars and translators. And the writing on the stone appeared to have a phrase that they could make out. And this phrase read, "This, according to the command of the greatest and most holy God, those who take the oath proceed from here." We'll discuss this oath and the stone in more detail in just a few minutes because this is no ordinary stone. Strangely enough, photographs of this temple where he found the stone, the temple of Khazar Antar, are almost non-existent today. Although many photos of the exploration were taken, they are extremely hard to come by on the internet. And even stranger, the site of a temple documented by Warren is now sealed off by the UN building that sits there today, and no modern photographs or videos exist of that temple, thanks to the United Nations. Now that standing stone or stele is currently housed at the British Museum, as we said. You can research it for yourself. It's listed as item number 1903-042-1, but I'm told it is no longer displayed to the public for, quote, unknown reasons. Did the UN have something to do with that as well? And although we can't see these things today, and isn't that very suspicious, it is very, very likely the disciples of Jesus did see them. You see, 6 days after Peter's confession of faith at the gates of hell, Jesus took Peter, James, and John up on that high mountain. What high mountain? The nearest one was right in front of them, Mount Hermon. It was on that high mountain that Jesus was transfigured before them so they could see his divinity. Not only could they see it, but Jesus likely did this on that very spot up there at the summit where that temple was, where that standing stone was, where the angels' rebellion started, where they descended to the earth according to Enoch. So it is almost a certainty in my mind, at least, that Jesus chose that spot around the temple complex in the presence of that stele or standing stone. You know, the angels' oath to one another to transform himself so the disciples could see it, and more importantly, so the angels, the fallen angels, could see who he was and what their future would be like. Why would he have chosen that spot? It was the location of Satan's minions' attack on the world, and God was going to announce his counterattack at that same location. That counterattack, of course, would take place shortly on the cross and ultimately conclude at the second coming. Okay, so now we know the significance of that location in the Bible. But you may be wondering about the significance of this tablet and what that strange inscription was all about. It all goes back to the book of Genesis in the Bible, where Genesis discusses the descent of the Watchers. In Genesis 6:4, we read, "There were giants in the earth on those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, the same became mighty men, which were of old of renown." Not long after Satan's temptation of Adam and Eve and the fall of man, and approximately 1,000 years before the flood, most people don't realize it was that long before the flood, 200 fallen angels, probably at the command of Satan, descended from their heavenly abode and began to try to corrupt the DNA of men by crossbreeding with humans. This is detailed in the book of Enoch, which is not part of the canon of Scripture, we need to make that clear, but was a very well-respected book, quoted even by Jesus and found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It tells a similar story to Genesis 6, and the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, meaning these women, and said to one another, "Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men and beget us children." And Semjaza, who was their leader, said unto them, "I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin." And they all answered him and said, "Let us all swear an oath." Notice that, an oath. "And all bind ourselves by mutual implications, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing." They then swore, they all together, and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Jared, on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by mutual imprecations upon it. Enoch 3, 2-5. So according to the book of Enoch, the fallen angels descended on Mount Hermon and took an oath to Semjaza and to each other to carry out Satan's plan to corrupt the DNA of mankind. Now Satan knew, and probably had told the others, that God planned to send a Savior, the Messiah, to crush Satan's head, and that Messiah would come from the seed of the woman. So he told them, and probably thought himself, that if they corrupted all the seed or DNA of women, there could be no Messiah. That was their plan. An inscription on the steel or standing stone is just such an oath. Let's look at it again. This, according to the command of the greatest and most holy God, those who take the oath proceed from here. So who was this greatest and most holy God? Was it the one true God of the Bible? Or was it Satan, who was their little g God? If this inscription was truly about the fallen angels, it wasn't the true God who gave this command, but rather it was Satan. So why does it say he was the greatest and holy God? Well, maybe it actually doesn't say that. In a discussion I had with Pastor Doug Hamp, I learned that this inscription might have more to it than the translation I just read to you. Is that why the steel or standing stone isn't visible to the public anymore? Well, it might be part of it. Here's what Doug said. And pay attention, because this is fascinating, and he really did great work in uncovering this. It didn't make any sense at all. It just wasn't working. So I wanted to see the inscription, to see what it actually said on the inscription. When I finally was able to track this thing down, and I started looking at it, I'm like, wait a second. It doesn't say holy. It says great, but it doesn't say holy. In fact, it's just not a Greek word. That's the bottom line. It's not a Greek word at all. It's a logogram. B-A-D. End of quote. So, a logogram is a letter equivalent or symbol for an individual. Just like the tetragrammaton, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, is a symbol of the true God, Yehovah. This B-A-D was a symbol the Sumerians used for their god that was the equivalent of who Satan is. Ancient Syrians used the same symbol, B-A-D, for Baal and Dagon, their Satan figures in their mythology. So rather than saying holy God, it actually says the great Satan God, or the great B-A-D bad God. By the way, B-A-D or bad is really ironic. And is it possible that's where we got the English word bad? Well, I mean, who knows? But it just strikes me as very odd if it doesn't mean that. Now, this brings us to modern days and the United Nations building this outpost that they have right where the ancient pagan temple was located. And essentially, it blocks all access to this ancient temple. Also strange is the fact that pictures of the temple have been all but removed from the internet. Not completely, but all but. Now, the conspiracy theorist in me sees a direct link between the fallen angels and the United Nations. As you are probably aware, this channel has been reporting for over 9 months about how the United Nations is planning something called the Summit for the Future in late September 2024, at which time they're hoping to get the nations to surrender their national sovereignty to the UN, so the UN will essentially control the governments of the world, and that this pact that the nations are planning to make amongst themselves and with the UN could be the covenant with the many from Daniel 9:27. You know, the one that launches the tribulation period. And I just find it odd that that standing stone or steel has a pact on it as well. A pact then, a pact in the future, fallen angels taking orders from Satan, possibly, the UN taking orders from a similar source. Adding to the intrigue is that UN building on the top of Mount Hermon is part of something called the UNDOF, the United Nations Disengagement Observer Force, which is located there between Israel and Syria to try and keep the peace. An Israeli-Palestinian peace plan will likely be part of the covenant with the many. So, a peacekeeping force hiding a temple of fallen angels? A number of interrelated biblical storylines all seem to interact and intersect right here at this one spot on the top of Mount Hermon, where the fallen angels descended and where Jesus counterattacked by being transformed before his disciples and before them. You just simply can't make this up. And now it's a UN site, and it's being hidden from the public. I mean, this is too incredible to not have end-time meeting. And you know, all of this seems to go back to 1947 and a supernatural event that happened that year. And within 2 more years after that event, Israel would become a nation. The Dead Sea Scrolls would be located. The United Nations would form. And UFO sightings would multiply all over the globe. All of these events appear necessary for the end times. Click right here to keep watching and discover the mystery of what may have happened in the desert of the USA in 1947 that led to all this. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.